Episode 9 of the Rugby Abroad podcast, and delighted to be here today with, and actually it's a really special episode because it's the first episode that I'm not speaking to a rugby player. I have with me today Kurk, sports psychologist, who, well, we spent some time together about, what would it be now, maybe 8 or 9 years ago when I was playing at Roslyn Park in London. And mate, I remember you helped me out in quite a difficult time, actually, when I was down at Roslyn Park. Things took a turn for the worst after a good season there, and they changed the head coach, and I found myself from being top point scorer and first name on the team sheet to being out of the team or on the bench with no real explanation. And I remember speaking to you at the time, and you really helped me keep a positive outlook on things. And yeah, mate, I wanted to start off by normally I've given an introduction to guys, but because they're players, I can sort of go chronologically with their playing careers and see what's what. But it might be just a bit more interesting if you can introduce yourself and tell us really like how you got into rugby or sports psychology. Was it something you knew you always wanted to be a sports psychologist, or just let us know from the very beginning how it all happened and your story?
Well, I guess the inception of the interest in sports psychology was just knowing that I enjoyed sport in a casual way, playing sport, but I knew I was never going to be anything above a recreational sports person. And I found the avenue of sports psychology just because it seemed different. A lot of my friends were going the sports science route, or maybe sports medicine or sports therapy or physiotherapy, and I thought I'd do something a little bit different. Well, basically, I just thought it might be easier to get a job if I'm one of the few doing it. So I ended up going to university for sports psychology and ended up getting a master's in sport and exercise psychology. And then when I met you, I was not long out of university, and it's interesting what you were saying about your experience there, because I noticed that with Park in particular, there was how do I put this delicately? There was you had to be in the right group to get picked. Okay. Essentially, I don't think hard work was rewarded as it should be, or should have been. Not necessarily with your first season, but when there was the change of the guard, I think it became a bit more cliquey. Okay. And it was hard for people to understand or break through if they were doing everything they were told by the coaching setup. This is what you need to do. This is what you need to work on. And then they successfully do that, and then there's no reward. Then there's going to be a big gap between who starts and who doesn't, and the mentality between the two.
Yeah, man, I guess there's a lot of teams and a lot of coaches who don't necessarily play by the rules straight down the line when it comes to team selection and things like that. So I guess that's the gap is there to be filled by someone in your position who can look at things maybe from the outside and really help a player to work through some things which really to him might seem just ridiculous or bad decisions on a coach's part, or maybe unfair, to get that different perspective on it. I think that shouldn't be underestimated, but I think maybe it is underestimated, certainly in the professional game. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. Acceptance of the position grew over time. It's a fairly new, widely accepted part of sport. Justifying it to coaches is harder than justifying it to players, because a lot of coaches come from an old school mentality, right? Sure. Where it was just sort of shut up, put your boots on and hit things as hard as you can. Yeah. Whereas now you look at the size of some of the people, and you'll know from playing against them, and you're not exactly a small bloke, but if I look at someone like you, who in a position of 10, for example, you've got to have the ability to do a wide variety of things at the snap of fingers. And being a giant bloke or being full of muscle isn't going to help you with that. That's your decision-making process or your communication skills or anything. Your match preparation is different person to person, and players are starting to understand that you can only do so much in the gym. There's something else that puts you apart from other people. Of course, there's natural ability that comes into play, but you can develop skills to make you a better athlete without it being in the gym. And that's what's being recognized more and more as time goes on.
Sure, yeah, no, it's interesting to hear. And just getting back to how you got into rugby specifically, was that something that just led on because of your love of the game, or did an opportunity arise after you finished your studies?
Yeah, so I was pretty lucky. My dad was actually a Premiership touch judge in rugby.
Okay, nice.
So I've always had rugby in my family. My granddad was also captain of France.
Wow.
So it's been around me. I've just not been the athlete to carry the torch. I thought I would carry the torch in another way, sort of academically, I suppose. And just through that, I had connections. I knew certain people, and I was able, when I was studying, to do my thesis on decision making under pressure for elite referees. So I had all the top referees, Nigel Owens, etc., performing a computer-based study about decision making and the decisions they'd make if it was a penalty here, there, whatever. And then through that I got to work with London Welsh as well during my master's year. So
was that before or after they got the promotion?
That was before. That was before. This was when this would have been 2010, 2011, around then. So quite a while back.
Yeah.
But some of the boys there you would have played with at Park, like Lorne Ward, Big Lorney.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was at London Welsh at the time. But yeah, it was good. It was a good introduction to what sport is from a playing side. Without it being too elite, but the mentality of everyone there being championship rugby is very different to being Premiership rugby.
Yeah, sure. And so that was a great experience that then led you to stick with rugby. Yeah,
it was more of a snowball effect than anything. I didn't look to stay in rugby. I also worked in cricket and on the academic side of things, but the rugby sort of word of mouth was really helpful in building a company and building a business in sports psychology. And from there, I kind of expanded. I got to go on a trip to Hong Kong free of charge to work on a charity rugby match over there. Like, it opened a lot of doors until I found myself, interestingly, kind of different to what you've been interviewing before, moving abroad, but not for the purposes of sport, but I had to leave sport behind a few years ago. So that it was a very interesting roller coaster for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting, man. So did you go knowing that you'd have to leave sport behind, or when you went abroad, or? Well,
I moved because I moved to Canada because I married a Canadian. So
makes sense.
It's the nature of the job.
Yeah.
and I did some research before I left on what the consideration of sports psychology is over here. And the brutal honesty is it's about 10 to 15 years behind the UK in terms of its thinking, development, acceptance, and just the availability of sport. So where I am, I actually live about 5 minutes away from the headquarters of Rugby Canada, which would be okay, but the setup isn't. It would be different if I lived 5 minutes away from the headquarters of the RFU and I knew people there.
Yeah.
Rugby Canada is quite fragmented from what it seems. And I'm not in a position in life where I could start again. I have a young family now and a mortgage, etc. When I was, leaving university, that was the great opportunity to try and start a business.
Yeah.
Without really knowing where it was going to go. But so I came with some research, but it basically just told me, don't bother.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's what I was doing. It's limited.
No, I mean it's limited, definitely. But I'm hearing things in Canada. They've got the MLR team. I think it's the Toronto Arrows who have picked up. I'm not sure if they're going to get another MLR team in the next couple of years as well.
Yeah, rugby's an interesting one here.
So maybe do you see some kind of potential there in the future to dip back in, or have you really written it off now? You've got other like you said, you've got other responsibilities now. It's not necessarily the reason why you moved, so maybe it's just pushed to the side, or is it something? Maybe I'll have a look at it if there's something.
The fire's always burning. There's always a little bit of a flame there.
Yeah.
It's interesting. So I live on the west coast of Canada, and it's actually where you would expect there to be a rugby team before anywhere else, because it's popular here. This is where they, at the Rugby Canada headquarters, is where they have one of the stops on the Women's Seven circuit, and it's sold out every year. And they do the Men's Sevens in Vancouver.
Yeah.
So they get, at the Men's Sevens, they get 20, 30,000 going every day to the Sevens.
Yeah.
It's definitely popular here. If there was an MLR team out here, there's no harm in making contact, right? But
absolutely not.
And equally, there's one kid I'm working with just through knowing his dad, who is a coach here of baseball.
Yeah.
But this kid is he's 14, and he's got potentially a future in baseball or basketball. He's very, very good at both, and his dad understands sport. He's a coach, and obviously there's different cultures around how you coach and I guess the youth pathways. But this kid, he's got his head screwed on properly, and it'll be interesting to see where I can go with that. And if there's a success with him, that can grow and it can just organically develop into something. I don't want to throw everything out the door and put all my eggs in one basket now with a 2-year-old running around and a mortgage to pay. It's tough.
Sure.
But yeah, I've used what I've gained from sport and applied that to professional life anyway. So I work in sort of the realm of project management with the government of British Columbia right now, and there's aspects of sport that translate to business quite easily.
Yeah.
So I'm definitely not leaving sport behind. I'm keeping my brain ticking.
Yeah.
But it's hard to stay up on the most recent research and it's interesting looking in now from the outside as to try and keep up. But yeah, I'm definitely not giving up for sure.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was going to mention to you the first time I had any contact with a sports psychologist is probably quite young, and it was when I was 14 years old and I was playing in Saracens amateur team, the Saracens amateur club there. That was my first rugby club, and they brought it. We had a really talented side, and quite a few of those guys have gone on to have rugby careers, and they brought in for us a sports psychologist who sort of started to work with us with the idea that your mind is much more powerful than you might realize at 14 years old. And I remember them doing this experiment with us. They had something on a string. I think it was a marble on a string or something, and you'd hold it up in front of you and you'd imagine or visualize it moving around in a circle. Obviously, it's just like a kid's magic trick, really. Like your 14-year-old sitting there, and you're just imagining it moving, and suddenly the thing's moving around and doing bigger and bigger circles. And you're like, now looking back on it, obviously, it's your mind's just telling your fingers to move in a certain way, but it was the most amazing thing, and it had quite a profound effect on me. It's something that I always remember, like thinking, okay, I can visualize something and then watch it manifest in reality, and it's kind of as simple as that. But once you extrapolate it out into real sport, professional sport, I'm a kicker myself, sort of a specialist goal kicker. Once you start applying that kind of visualization skill to a technique like kicking or throwing and things like that, then it starts to get really interesting, and you hear a lot of lot of kickers. You hear the Johnny Wilkinson story and the techniques that they use around visualization. And it was such a young age to start using those techniques. I thought it was great from whoever was those coaches at the time, and I just can't imagine that that's being repeated for kids around the country who are involved in sport. I might be completely wrong, and you might have a completely different experience of that. Maybe it's just we were lucky to have someone studying the sports psychology at that time in that place.
Yeah, I think it's a combination. I think you were lucky to have someone studying sports psychology at that time, and you were also lucky to be in an environment where someone said, "Yeah, we'll give it a go. Let's just see what happens." A lot of what you'll find, and what I found at my old university, there was a research project that was going on when I left for Canada, that was run by Dr. Andy Morley. He's a great guy in sports psychology, and he was looking at the development of elite athletes from the youngest age they can remember all the way through to whatever stage they were at in their career, whether that was retirement or not, or they were, just halfway through their career, whatever it was to that point. And interestingly, I believe more often than not, those that were elite, top of their sport, whatever, just accepted whatever it was somebody was trying to do to help them. Even if they had no knowledge of it, they may not have even agreed with it at first, but if you walk into somewhere and you say, I've got this and it might make you better, those who really reach the top are the ones who go, try it, let's see what happens. So it's opportunity, but it's also acceptance. So you were just in a good environment at that age that allowed somebody to walk in and say, I think this might make your team better, whether it's now or it gives them just a little skill that will grow into the future. Like you said, that's such a simple, the marble on a string is so simple, but then you think that you connect to it now with goal kicking.
Yeah.
So it's nice to know that happened. And I think it happens more now than it would have done when you were 14. But yeah, it's something that I think youth or young athletes should have as part of their coaching setup, for sure.
Yeah, as part of their development, so to speak. It should be on their syllabus.
Yeah, and the reason I say that is because if you have an athlete who's gone through youth academy level and reached, say, Premiership Rugby, and they've never had an injury, like they've been one of those lucky ones, right? They've never had an injury, they've never had a setback, they've just kept going up and up and up, and suddenly they get injured and they can't play for 6 to 8 months. They've never had the support or the experience before then to understand what it takes to come back from that moment. If you have a young athlete who's been injured at 16, so they've slowed their development by a year, but they've been working with a sports psychologist who still helps them mentally because they can't work physically during that amount of time.
Yeah.
They have the tools that, it may take longer in that pathway, but they'll have the tools when they get to the elite level. When there is a setback, it won't affect them as much. So I think having the support at a young level helps. Whether they need a sports psychologist or choose to use a sports psychologist later in their careers, they will already have the tools there themselves.
Yeah.
Or a baseline of tools to be able to assist them when things can and do go wrong. Yeah.
Do you think, sort of, you mentioned maybe nowadays you're more likely to see a sports psychologist in the mix? Is this the whole conversation around mental health that's going on, certainly in the UK? I'm not sure if there's the same interest over in Canada, but it's definitely, well, I'm not exactly in the UK right now, being locked down over here in Italy still, but I'm hearing on the grapevine that there's a massive conversation going on around mental health, around how clubs help players with regards to these sort of setbacks you were talking about, with long-term injuries, with maybe careers ending and kind of related depression that follows. Is that sort of how the conversation around that having an impact on, or have you on your career? Not yours specifically, but certainly those of other sports psychologists.
Yeah, it's a very multifaceted thought process, right? So you can prepare yourself in advance for retirement. It helps if you look at someone like James Haskell, right? He's set himself up to leave rugby behind. It may not have been easy, but it's coming, and he saw that in advance, and now he's continuing on, and he's not bored as such. Probably busier than he's ever been, I would imagine. But so that's like retirement is a tricky one. It's sort of how you set yourself up for that, and opportunities that may or may not come to you. And it's difficult at different levels of rugby as well. You look at the championship, right? Or you look at, well, in National One, I guess most people, you'll be having a job as well as playing rugby. Championship, some will, and then Premiership, you'd expect people to just be trying to carve out their careers for post-rugby. Yeah. In terms of the mental health side, when playing sport with professional athletes, it's very interesting to see the mentality towards mental health changing, because I mean it's money doesn't buy you happiness, right? A lot of professional athletes make a ton of money, but money doesn't buy you happiness. Anybody can have mental health problems or mental health issues or mental health concerns, or just want to know about mental health in general. And I think before, especially when I was starting out in sports psychology, there was a big mentality of using a psychologist was because you had a problem. That was the thought, as opposed to you use a psychologist to enhance your skills or be better than you are currently in what you're doing, perform to a higher level. So I think there's different approaches towards mental health. There's performance side, but if you're not performing well, that can feed into the other side of mental health, right? Yeah. If you're not being selected, if you're not going to be offered a new contract, it's not as public in Canada, I don't think, but just because they don't have the sporting infrastructure that the UK has.
Sure.
And the culture is, as I said to you before, the culture is, no crying in baseball, no like this. It's you just put up with it and you shut up. It's very old school.
Yeah.
And you see that in the coaching. But again, it's growing. It's growing. But the mental health side is very important, and it's good that there's elite level athletes who are publicly coming out and saying about their depression and about what's happened to them, and hopefully that will allow athletes to lean on that somewhat and provide a platform for them to not be ashamed or put off from saying that away from performance. I'm struggling with my mental health, and it's affecting me at work.
Yeah, look, I wanted to touch on this because the podcast, you're not quite in line with the I've gone abroad to continue my sport. However, your role as a psychologist in this sense is so important for seeing people's issues or problems or potential with sport, rugby specifically. And I wanted to ask you about guys that go abroad to play rugby. And you mentioned it just now that some guys are coming out more and saying that they've got problems and things like that. A lot of guys are very proud guys. I think men in general are very proud. Yeah. I discussed it on a recent podcast with a guy, an ex-Irish international called Jamie Hagan. He's currently playing down in France in Béziers in the Pro D2, and he's been around the world with his rugby. But he wasn't shy to speak about those lows that he had when he was playing down in Melbourne in the Super Rugby down there, and he was it sounded like he was in a real low place. But I think what he was saying was just talking about it, even on a platform like this, having a conversation, knowing that maybe other people might listen and it might give them an idea of how it might help to share that kind of feeling or with someone in a similar situation. How important that is. I don't know if what your thoughts are on guys playing rugby abroad and how that could be like a mental burden in itself, because I think about it in two ways. Like there's the side of it, which is this is the adventure. You're on a journey and you're having an amazing experience of a new culture and stuff. And maybe you can relate to this bit being abroad as well. And the other side of it is, well, you're away from your family. And I spoke to a Spanish international on the podcast as well about this, who was playing professionally in England with Leicester Tigers and Northampton. He found himself completely alone, didn't have any friends immediately. He was sort of isolated within the team environment, didn't like the food, but he was there for the love of the game. And so there's the two sides of it. I just wanted to know from your like professional opinion, what's your viewpoint, your standpoint on playing rugby abroad with regards to that?
It's a very interesting point, because even if you just remove the rugby from it and the moving abroad thing, I have a very similar thought process to that. So I underestimate. So let's say my rugby is my family. I moved to Canada for my family. And then everything around it just is what it is. I wanted to be with my family, so this is where we are. If you then, over time, the excitement of being in this new environment kind of it slows down. You're always happy to be there, but then you start to think, okay, well, I've now isolated myself from everything that I knew. Any friends I had are not here. I have to create new friends, which sounds simple, but it's a support network when it comes to mental health. If you feel isolated, and you can talk yourself into being isolated, even if you're not isolated.
Yeah. Sure.
With rugby, there's a nice opportunity to have this camaraderie around you. You're already, you're moving there to be in a squad of 30, 40 blokes who all have the same, at the end of the day, similar goals to you. So there is a natural support network there that you could use, but the problem is the talking about it, as you said, is the low points can be so low for people that they don't want to be a burden. So they don't want to speak to somebody about it. You don't want to bring other people down to what you are feeling. So it's not always a selfish thing to just keep to yourself with things like that. It's actually could be a selfless thing, but it's a misguided selfless act. The key is talking, for sure. The key is talking, because there's a perception, and like you said before, like with men in particular, but also in sport in particular, there is a perception that it might be a sign of weakness. But I guarantee if it's spoken about, the support that would follow would be above and beyond what was expected. So talking is key. Moving abroad for rugby, it doesn't always work out. Like, that's the thing. It's a risk. Everything comes with a risk. You've been lucky enough to, I guess, you're Europe trot as opposed to globe trot. But you've, how have you found moving? Because you didn't just move abroad. You moved abroad and then again and then again.
Yeah.
So how have you found the change of culture place to place?
Well, the first thing I said to you around these two ways of looking at the how you look at moving abroad, I'm on the first side of the fence, where any culture, any new experience, I'd see it all as an adventure. I love learning languages. Again, the support network's already there for me because of the rugby. So I know I'm going into a bunch of 30 guys. It's going to be, for me, my personality and my position in the team means that it's going to be relatively easy for me to settle and quickly. Or at least I go with that attitude every time I move. It's not always been because I've wanted to move. Some of the moves have been, I'd say, forced, or the opportunities have presented themselves at the time that not necessarily were my ideal options, but I've just gone with the flow a little bit. However, you got me thinking just now about, well, it might be easy for me in my rugby environment, but I tell you what, for my wife, who doesn't have that same support network, but is coming along with me, that's a different story altogether, and it's much harder for her to assimilate to a new culture, to a move, to having to move every year, or every couple, and being away from her day to day, her friends, family, and stuff, than it is for someone going into a team environment who knows that he's going to have all the things he had in his home country there, sort of ready to go. In when you're talking about a rugby club, even if the language might be different, you at least know what you're getting yourself into. But if you're someone who's coming along for the ride, well, I can see how that can be a real tough time. So, like you say, it's important. So I think it's so important to create that support network quickly, to have people around you, family or whoever, who understand the situation that you're in, who are available to, whether it's to come visit, to speak. I mean, technology nowadays is an incredible thing to be able to, even during the lockdown. Like, I mean, we're speaking from Italy to Canada right now, and we're speaking like, I mean, your internet connection's phenomenal in comparison to some of the, considering you're on Vancouver Island, which I didn't even know they had Wi-Fi out there. no, mate, it is to be abroad, even in what's just happened with, imagine the amount of rugby players abroad away from their families, and with the COVID-19 coming in, they're all locked down in their homes. They're not able to access that team environment, and they're then they're able to use Zoom or Skype or to contact home to speak to their family as if they're there. You know, that's a massive thing for me, and yeah, because you're leaving behind a lot to have these what I perceive as great experiences abroad. Others might not. Close family might be missing you a lot. It's the same if you're moving abroad for any job, I guess.
Yeah, and it's interesting that what you mentioned about sort of, your wife has to come along with you. Like, that's just the nature of the business. But and as you say, when you walk into a rugby club, you've immediately got, if you're open and if you want to talk and if you are the kind of person who's a bit of an open book, you have an immediate 30-person network right off the bat. Whereas you then, without realizing, you actually become that 30-person support network for your wife.
Yeah.
Right off the bat, because she, if you've moved to Italy, I don't know, she may or may not know people in where you've moved to in Italy, but if she doesn't, then that's fully on you, and you assume a kind of like a pseudo psychologist role, because you have to be that foundation that makes it okay to go out and adventure from.
Sure.
Your foundation of adventure is rugby, which is great and it's exciting, and of course, take every opportunity you can if that's what it is to you. But then your thoughts on rugby, she has to have the same thoughts for something else, and that has to be you. So as long as you're a good person.
Well, exactly, mate. No, you're absolutely right. And to be honest, I've had to therefore take that into account with some of my career decisions. France is a great place for rugby, certainly economically speaking. However, it certainly wasn't the best place for my particular situation, our family. So the last move I made to Italy was one taking everything into account, and not just my adventuring mind and my progression of rugby. Certainly, maybe if I was younger at the time, that might have taken more of a primary role in my thinking, the rugby side of things. But having a young family like yourself, this last move to Italy was really with them in mind, and where might be culturally the best place to be at the time, rather than thinking. So things change, I guess, with your age, and I guess some of the people listening might be just 18, 19, 20 years old, coming out of school, university, thinking about having experiences abroad, and thinking on my side of the fence, which is the adventure, go and get it, basically, go and have an experience, go abroad, and it's just something to be aware of, I guess, that maybe not for them to even think about, but just looking further down the line for guys like my age, it's something to, when they're thinking about settling down, and having families and stuff, the responsibilities, I guess, change. Have you seen that with clients? And
Yeah, I mean, as you say, as you've got older, you've become a little bit more self-aware, and aware of what's going on around you, as opposed to just, this is fun for me, so I'm going to do it. And there's absolutely no harm in that if that's where you are in life. And one of my
wife might disagree with that, but
well, one of my favorite phrases is, the right time to do something is the time that you're doing it. Because I don't think anybody should say, well, this person did something then, and because they did this, that means I'm past it, or I'm not old enough, I'm not experienced enough to do that yet. Do what feels right. And as you grow and as you develop, you will develop skills. Like, self-awareness is a skill. It's a skill that I'm still working on, for sure. It's never something that you reach the end of. But moving abroad,
maybe Buddha.
Maybe. I mean, we're all trying, right? But moving abroad for professional sport, it's a lot of pressure, because you have the pressure of upholding your family roots, as well as performing on the other side of the coin, which is for the reason you moved.
Sure.
It's a lot of pressure. So if you don't have that family attachment, then that's one part of the pressure that you wouldn't necessarily feel. So I get it. Like you say, it was great. It might have been great financially to be in France, but you've got another side to look at. Like, you can play well in France and then stay in France and make more money, make it to the, Division 1 in France. But is that the right thing to do for your moment in time? And you had to make that call. And I bet your wife appreciates it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I hope so. Otherwise, she watches this, I might be in trouble for even mentioning her. No, mate. No, it's great to get that outside perspective. I think. Look, you were involved in rugby. When was the last time you were involved in rugby?
So I moved. It would have been the start of the rugby season in 2016. So okay, yeah, I moved here in December 2016. So it's been 3.5 years since I moved to Canada.
So you're seeing a lot of changes in the sport, I guess, since then. But fundamentally, you'll still have the same sort of issues present in the game. Is there anything or the direction that the sport is moving? Are you still in touch with the sport? Do you follow it? Do you speak to rugby guys still at all back home, or?
Yeah, I still keep in touch with a few back home. That's the great thing about rugby, is it is a community, and even if you move somewhere, you've still got some of the boys reaching out, seeing how you're doing, and vice versa. And it's always nice to feel that little bit of home again.
Yeah.
The direction that I see sport going in, I mean, recently it's just completely gone up in the air, isn't it? Yeah. It was before I saw, and you saw it in the media with Saracens, a lot of it was just becoming about the money. And I get it, rugby is a very short shelf life. The revenue and the money became a huge focus, and then it came into focus for the wider sporting community by what happened with Saracens.
Yeah.
And I think, in a way, this is going to that situation and the pandemic is going to really help ground rugby again. I think you do need the finances. You need to let players know that they're sacrificing their bodies for something.
Yeah.
Obviously, there's pride, right? The pride comes with it. It's to run out on a rugby field in front of however many 100,000 people over the course of your career is great, and you represent something. But it does end, right? There is a conclusion, and it's a lot earlier than in most industries, and the risks are much greater than in most industries too.
Yeah.
You look at there's some of the young people or the younger athletes at Boston Park when we were there, who some have kicked on to great things, some should have done, but through outside of their own control haven't been able to. Injuries, just lack of opportunity, whether they were talented or not. And that's hard. So I think it would be nice to see rugby become more grounded, have a bit of a global calendar. That's what I would like to see. Have things line up so that everybody can share in the experiences at the same time, no matter where they are. And hopefully it will provide a nice foundation to build from post-pandemic for rugby, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome observation to end our conversation. Episode 9 of the podcast. We've got there. We've done a non-rugby player podcast, which is awesome. Mate, I really appreciate your outside look on things. Your take has been awesome as a sports psychologist or former rugby sports psychologist. Hopefully you can get back into it in the future at some point, maybe.
One day, it would be nice. Give me a call, Catsy.
Yeah, for sure. When I'm that head coach.
Yeah, exactly.
Watch this space. Watch this space, mate. No, Harry, I really appreciate it, mate. And yeah, I look forward to chatting again soon.
Absolutely.
And we'll have to get you on the podcast once this global rugby sort of initiative that you're talking about has kicked off post-pandemic again.
Once I'm in charge of World Rugby, yeah, I'll be there.
Nice one, mate. Again, appreciate your time, and we'll speak soon.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
You can subscribe to the podcast at rugbyabroad.com. Thanks for listening in, and I hope you join me for the journey.